Hey there YouTube, it's Ryan from Ryan Welton Music, and I've got something different for you today. It's Ryan's first book review here. I'm reviewing a book called The Gatekeepers by Chris Whipple, and if you like the presidency, politics, government, how it all functions, or even the television show The West Wing, you might dig this book review. Stick around. So Christy and I have been watching The West Wing from the very beginning, and we've always loved Leo McGarry and how he interacts with President Bartlet. Leo McGarry is the chief of staff. He's the guy who intercedes on the president's behalf to make sure that the right people get access, the wrong people don't, and to oftentimes be the president's son of a bitch. But what I didn't know were a number of things that Chris Whipple wrote about in this book. Did I mention that Chris Whipple is a journalist, a documentarian, a filmmaker who's worked on 60 Minutes and ABC Primetime? He actually talked with all of the living chiefs of staff, both Republican and Democrat, and even a couple of presidents to talk about how their role impacted successes and failures in these administrations. He starts with Nixon. Haldeman was Nixon's son of a bitch. Haldeman appealed to not Nixon's better angels, because Nixon, I think most historians agree, didn't really have any better angels. He was a paranoid man. He might have done some good things in terms of China and the environment, but largely Haldeman kept Nixon from blowing the place up, right? Nixon wanted to give a lie detector test to everybody in the White House. Nixon actually wanted to blow something up here in America. I forgot what it was, but I think it was like an enemy or something, and Haldeman kept him from it. But Haldeman also didn't serve the president well when it came to Watergate, and wasn't an honest broker enough, not honest enough with the president, and making him understand he needed to be more forthright with the American people, and that eventually led to Nixon's resignation. We have Ford in the mid-70s, and Whipple paints a picture of a Ford administration that probably was just getting going by the time that Ford lost to Carter in 1976. Ford was served by Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. Recognize those names from W's administration in the early 2000s? Would you believe that Dick Cheney was considered to be probably the friendliest, nicest chief of staff we've ever had? I'm not kidding. True story. Both sides agree to this. He was just a different cat in 1975 than he was as a Darth Vader strong man vice president in the 2000s. And by the way, when I mentioned that Dick Cheney was the exception to the rule of the chief of staff being the second most powerful person in the executive branch, Cheney was more powerful than Andy Card in W's administration, largely speaking, and Cheney was really the architect of everything that W did then, at least in terms of foreign policy. But Rumsfeld and Cheney were particularly successful under Ford in terms of helping Gerald, who was a very nice, kind man who didn't want to offend anybody, helping him understand how Washington works. Mind you, I get it, Ford was in Congress. But these guys knew how to get things done at a bureaucratic, governmental, congressional level. Carter comes along and decides he doesn't even want a chief of staff. Hamilton, Jordan, and Jack Watson came with him. The experts said that Jack Watson should have been the chief of staff, but Jimmy picked Hamilton Jordan after 2 years. Jimmy Carter, see, wanted to do it all himself. That's always a mistake. The executive shouldn't do it himself. The executive needs to sit back and make decisions while somebody helps him with that stuff. There's a lot to be learned about corporate America in a book like this. Hamilton Jordan, though, comes along after 2.5 years after Jimmy Carter struggled to get a domestic agenda going, and by that time, he's enveloped in crises. Jack Watson comes along, can't save it. Jimmy Carter's a one-term president. Here comes Ronald Reagan, a man who was a B-movie actor in movies like Bedtime for Bonzo. His first chief of staff, James Baker, did not think that Reagan was going to be a successful president. How could he be? What does he know about Washington? Sure, he was a governor from California, but Baker was there to make sure that he knew how to navigate the streams. Baker, see, he was a Bush man, not a Reagan man, and Reagan and Bush are like Bartlett and Hoynes. They coexisted together for mutual benefit, and that's it. They didn't necessarily like each other, but they got along. Bush, remember, is the guy who coined the phrase voodoo economics when it comes to Reaganomics. But Baker was a steady hand and a very, very nice man who really coveted a cabinet position. And after Reagan's re-election in 1984, a landslide, by the way, he traded positions with Don Regan. Don Regan comes in and he's like, I want to be chief of staff. And Baker's like, I just want a comfy Treasury Secretary position. They trade, Regan comes in and immediately offends Nancy Reagan. One thing to know about FLOTUS, she has her own chief of staff. However, POTUS's chief of staff better not alienate the First Lady. Nancy Reagan and Hillary Clinton were as much of a chief of staff as any of their chief of staffs were. Nancy was running things. Nancy was a boss. Hillary was a boss in their respective administrations, right? Don Regan made the mistake of hanging up on Nancy in a phone call. Gone. You can't stay like that. In fact, I think Reagan was at the helm during Iran-Contra and a lot of things. When you look at Reagan's first term and his second term, just note that James Baker was the chief of staff during the first term, and note how the second term went. True story. So H.W. Bush comes along, and he perplexes everybody by picking John Sununu out of New Hampshire. Maybe it's because Sununu was able to navigate New Hampshire, but he's a New Hampshire man, not a Washington man. And by the way, by all accounts, he was kind of an a-hole. Andy Card even commented, I believe it was Andy Card, forgive me if I'm misrepresenting, but said that how is Sununu going to work as a chief of staff if everybody hated him? That's no different than the workplaces where we work. We have to get along with people. Eventually, after a couple of years, most chiefs of staff resign. It either wears them out because the job is 24/7 truly, or they wear out their welcome. Clinton comes along, and while he had a chief of staff at the beginning in Matt McLarty, it wasn't effective because Matt McLarty couldn't keep everybody out. Bill Clinton would have meetings in the Oval Office with 15 people in there. Too many voices, not enough discernment, not enough keeping the wrong people out. And eventually, Clinton realized he needed an iron hand. And I believe Whipple describes him as an iron hand in a velvet glove, an iron fist in a velvet glove, and that's Leon Panetta. Panetta comes in and rights the ship, and then Clinton has welfare reform and ends up winning in 1996 pretty handily. I'll tell you, under Clinton and both Obama, there was a lot of thought that they would be one-term presidents within their administration because they weren't getting things done as they should. All of these presidential administrations struggle early on because there's a lot to grasp. But under Clinton, you had Panetta, and you also had John Podesta, who was a fantastic chief of staff as well. So W comes along, and he picks one of his dad's guys, Andy Card. Andy Card is the guy who was whispering in W's ear when September 11th happened. Andy Card, largely a nice guy, but I will tell you, probably the weakest of all the chiefs of staff because of Dick Cheney and his role. Dick Cheney had been a chief of staff, and Cheney was very much a strong man in terms of how the foreign policy was put together and how Iraq was put together. All right, so you have Obama come along, and he brings Rahm Emanuel, who worked in the Clinton administration, and Rahm Emanuel was another one of the Chicago guys, right, the Chicago Mafia. Most people suggested to Obama that he shouldn't have somebody from Chicago as his chief of staff. But the thing that Obama, I think, particularly liked about Rahm is that he just got stuff done. A lot of people didn't like him. In fact, there are a couple quotes in there that will blow your mind. You're like, whoa, a progressive administration says something like that to a woman? All right, but I guess that's how things get done in the White House. Very, very tough going, and Rahm Emanuel was a very, very tough guy. Rahm Emanuel left, went back home to Chicago, became mayor, and then you had Peter Rouse come in. I don't think that he and Obama ever saw eye to eye. And then Obama's probably his favorite chief of staff comes along, a guy named Dennis McDonough. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. But Dennis McDonough, he was the guy who was at the helm when healthcare.gov magically failed in 2013 and nobody could access it and it was a bad deal. But what you don't know, the inside story that's told in the Whipple book, is that Obama was part of all those meetings, and President Obama reminded them at the end of every meeting that if this website doesn't work, the whole thing is going to be seen as a failure. They had a meeting every Monday. He said it literally every Monday. And McDonough, his failure was not in making sure that each piece worked technically. He did that. He just didn't oversee the whole thing. There wasn't enough testing done, not enough QA. For all of you people who work in QA and testing, props to you. He failed there. And Dennis McDonough said his sadness about the whole deal was that Obama didn't yell at him. Obama, he didn't really say anything to him. He was just sort of like, I told you. I told you. And just how bad did that make him feel? Because at one time you're serving your country, but you're also serving that man. You represent the president. All right? Whipple does go on to talk about Donald Trump and how important it's going to be to have a chief of staff. His first one was Priebus, second one is General Kelly. To have a guy who can tell him when he's not doing something that's very smart. The chief of staff has to be the one person in the White House who could tell the president he's an idiot without getting fired, right? You got to call the president Mr. President. You can't call him an idiot. That's not a good idea. But the chief of staff has to be able to let the president know when he or she is doing something wrong. And this book fascinatingly documents how that has worked from the early 1970s until just a couple of years ago. I highly recommend it. If you're a fan of The West Wing, this will help you understand the show and understand the American federal government so much better. It also makes me want to read one of his first works, or the one before this, called The Spy Masters, about the CIA. It's an easy read. It's 300 pages. It's an easy get. Go read it. Thanks for watching.